Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cyber Seminar Series, Hydrologic Science and Indigenous Voices. Quasi is excited to host this series alongside Dr. Maribeth Kniffin. This series is today's webinar is a continuation of a series that's been going on for a number of weeks now. If you're interested in the previous two webinars, I'd encourage you to check those out on the Quasi YouTube channel. We have two more webinars in this series as well in the coming weeks. So please join us for those. You can read kind of an overview of the series here and the intention behind it. We'll go into that more in just a moment. Before I hand things off to our speakers today and our host, Maribeth, I wanted to give a brief overview of Quasi while folks are still getting settled. My name is Julia Masterman. I'm the Education and Outreach Specialist for Quasi. Quasi is a consortium of universities for the advancement of hydrologic science. We're a nonprofit organization funded in part by the National Science Foundation. Our mission is to advance water science by strengthening interdisciplinary collaboration, providing critical infrastructure through our data services, and promoting education in the water sciences at all levels. We seek to fulfill this mission in two main ways, through our data services and through our community services. Our Quasi's data and compute services provide tools and support for the entire data lifecycle, from data discovery all the way through to collaboration and publication. Quasi hosts two data repositories for water science data, HydroShare and HIS, which is also known as data.quasi.org. The hope is that by providing this support and infrastructure, Quasi can help researchers formulate and execute their data management plans, be effective data stewards, and meet the requirements for funding agencies. The other side of our organization is our community services. These include grants, workshops, a summer institute at the National Water Center for graduate students, webinar series and events like this one, and a virtual university, along with a guest lecture database. We also seek to be a resource to the water science community as a whole. There are a number of community meetings coming up, including two meetings we will be exhibiting at. ModFlow is wrapping up today, as well as the Frontiers in Hydrology meeting later this month. I wanted to mention that if anyone is planning on attending FIHM, Maribeth will be moderating a workshop called Ideation Through Art to create inclusive futures. And if you're interested, be sure to look out for that. But there's plenty going on at Quasi and more coming soon. We have plenty of workshops and webinars coming up this summer and fall that will be announced very soon. I'd encourage you to visit our recently updated website to sign up for our newsletter and join our community Slack channel to learn more about Quasi and to stay up to date with everything that's going on. I'll add information on many of these things in the chat in a moment, along with the contact information in case anything Quasi related comes up. Before we get started, and I pass the mic to our speakers today, a few logistical things. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Quasi YouTube channel later this afternoon. Secondly, we ask that you use the Q&A functionality to submit questions to our speakers. Finally, we expect that all involved with Quasi Cyber Seminars uphold the Quasi Code of Conduct and promote and maintain a professional, considerate, respectful, and collaborative virtual environment. I would like to introduce the convener of this series, Dr. Maribeth Kniffin, who will then introduce today's fantastic speaker. Dr. Kniffin is a research affiliate at the University of California, Davis, a hydrologist and founder of Riverbytes, LLC. She also serves as the vice chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Standing Committee here at Quasi and is a scholar with the River Field Studies Network. She's a hydrologist whose research involves hydrologic and hydrogeologic fieldwork and computational modeling, as well as collaborative modeling with stakeholders for water management. She is passionate about the use of community-based scientific research to face environmental concerns like climate change. During her PhD at University of Wisconsin, she worked with small groups, advisory committees, and conducted in-person interviews to co-develop land and water management scenarios to inform land and water use practices, to empower local communities to make informed decisions. Dr. Kniffin has convened the series with the intention of bringing together Indigenous leaders in water knowledge and hydrologic science to explore how hydrologic sciences are defined and who is included in that definition. Thank you, Maribeth, for inviting such a fantastic lineup of speakers. And with that, I will pass the mic to you to introduce Dr. Grace Bulltail.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. And thank you all for your presence here today and your interest in this series. So I'm going to, before I introduce this speaker, I just want to invite you all to think about potential tangible outcomes of the Cyber Seminar series that could create more inclusivity in the hydrologic sciences. So if you're interested in following up with this event, please subscribe to a listserv or send an email to the emails that I'll put in the chat in a bit. So today we have the pleasure and honor to speak with Dr. Grace Bulltail. Dr. Grace Bulltail is of the Crow tribe and a descendant of the Madam, Hidasta, and Arikara Nation. Grace is currently an assistant professor in biological systems engineering and the Nelson Institute Center for Sustainability and the Global Environment at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She received a Bachelor's of Science in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Stanford. She completed her master's degree programs at Montana Tech and Columbia University, and a doctoral program in the Department of Biological and Environmental Engineering in the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences at Cornell University. Her research focuses on water quality impacts from natural resource development in tribal communities. Grace has worked as an engineer developing water resource infrastructure projects prior to starting her doctoral program. She also served as an engineering instructor at the United Tribes Technical College and still continues to work as a consulting engineer. She is a recipient of the GEM Foundation Fellowship, Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership Fellowship, NSF IGERT Fellowship, and Cornell Coleman Fellowship in completing her graduate studies. Grace has also participated in American Indian Science and Engineering Society programming for over 20 years and is an ISIS Sequoia member. Welcome, Grace, and thank you very much for being here today.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me.
So I was wondering if you would be willing to start out by talking about how you interact with and study water in your research.
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned my my work experience in the bio. I think that has really informed what I'm interested in studying and how I want to direct my research program. So I work professionally as a civil engineer, civil and environmental engineer, before I started my graduate work. I think that was really helpful in getting practical experience and realizing that that I was more drawn to teaching and looking at research questions than what I could in working in industry. And I would encourage other students to do that as well if that's something that they're interested in, because you never really know until you try something. But that was really helpful to me. I worked in California for some environmental firms, and then later in Montana for more rural projects that were really anything from land parcel development to irrigation, and it was very, very hands-on. And then eventually I was able to work for my own tribal governments, and that's where I really saw the disparities that that are in tribal communities in terms of having the technical capacity workforce. I was always interested in why our communities didn't have really strong environmental programs, water management programs. And it's really a larger issue that that often goes way back to the treaties and the states' rights. And for example, I didn't start working for my own tribe until we received a water settlement in 2010. And from that, the tribe then started a water resources program. And my role in that was as an engineer. And I was the only engineer on staff, and we were trying to develop projects that are, multi-million-dollar projects over our 2 million acre tribal land base. And we were in meetings with the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation that had departments of engineers, and also trying to build our capacity as much as we could, and really build up the workforce within the tribe. And I just realized how big of an issue that is, and it's continuing to be a barrier for tribes to take on this role of self-determination, to guide these projects in ways that will be helpful to them and most appropriate to them. And I also just saw the role of the federal government in any federally funded project. The amount of extra work that we had to do that's required. It was really an eye-opening experience. And from that, I continue to look at ways that tribal governments can better assert their sovereignty in things, for example, of protecting their waterways. But it really comes down to having the capacity to do that, and also being mindful of the policies that are in place that often give the states more rights than it's an inequitable relationship often, that tribes aren't able to do things such as declare that they have impaired water quality in their waterways, and therefore limit the amount of contaminants that will be discharged into their waterways through permitting that the state allows, that the EPA allows. And the state does not cover tribal lands in this way. So that's just one example. And I very much saw the same types of relationships in my work with my mother's tribe in Fort Berthold, the 3 affiliated tribes who are greatly impacted by oil and gas development in the Bakken Formation. The amount of work that the tribe had to do in trying to regulate really any type of environmental protections was just so inequitable. Again, there were very few technical staff that were working on these problems, dealing with produced water spills, and that was very serious in the Bakken because of the amount of contaminants that are in those produced waters, and then eventually reaching the tribe's water source. Yeah, I mean, it really made me want to look at these questions further, and to think about how there's a larger question of building capacity in tribal communities, particularly ones that are affected by resource development and that don't have full water rights, or are just now receiving those water rights. And also thinking about equity in building these workforces, and just questions of environmental justice in addressing these problems as well.
Yeah, I hear the importance of all of those experiences in working in the working world that has then informed the way that you look at everything you do now in the academic world. Am I hearing that correctly? Is that just the importance of those real life experiences and seeing the inequities and the sort of the capacity shortages.
Yeah. And I also really had a transformative experience in working with the tribal college. I was an engineering instructor before at a tribal college before I started my PhD program. And I think that really made me want to focus on building the scholarship in this area. When in my engineering courses, in my experience, we never talked about tribal communities, really indigenous communities. And, that's something that I was encouraged to do as an instructor at a tribal college, to make that curriculum relevant to the students. And I mean, there's just so many things that are relevant to to engineering, to infrastructure, water resources in the Dakotas where I was teaching, in Montana. And I think it's just because that material isn't out there. I always say I want to create the scholarship that I would like to read, and that includes these nuances that we don't really see in this type of coverage. So that really solidified my my commitment to being a researcher, to being an educator. And in that program, it was a 2-year degree that would eventually help students transition to a 4-year program at another college. And several tribal colleges have this type of arrangement with a larger university to get a bachelor's degree. But to prepare those students with that foundation, and just to have that experience with other Indigenous students at the tribal college. That was really some of the first times, and even now at a mainstream university, that I've had Indigenous students in my classes, and that they were interested in research that was relevant, in case studies that were relevant to where they are from. And we do need engineers and scientists in our communities. Not everyone has to go on to get a PhD. We do need people that can be water scientists, that can help build these projects. And I would say that several of my students from that cohort have gone on to do that. And it's something that I'm supportive of, is for students that I teach to go on to work professionally and eventually go on to graduate work if that's something that they're interested in.
Yeah, so you're really meeting that capacity building need that you saw when you were in the workforce, it sounds like. Can you talk a little bit about, you had mentioned, now you're at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, so a major research institution. And can you talk a little bit about how you shape your research and how your past experience informs your research at your present institution?
Yeah, so I'm currently in the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, so it's very interdisciplinary, and I'm allowed to really teach on a variety of subjects that I'm interested in. So I would say that that's something that that has been helpful to me in really thinking about how I want to shape my program, the types of things that I want to cover in my classroom. I teach an undergraduate course on environmental justice in Indigenous communities, and a lot of the work that we cover has to do with resource extraction. So, an area that I'm really familiar with, that's definitely an issue with tribal communities here in the Midwest, in the state, and students are always interested in what's happening in the state that they're located in. So, really trying to make that relevant to them as well. In a graduate course, I teach on infrastructure and Indigenous water resources. I really get into the history of tribal government relationships with the development and the colonization of the West, and the histories of building large scale government funded irrigation projects, dams, hydropower, and look at the legacies of that, and what that meant for the settling of the West. All of these government funded bills that were going through, the Reclamation Act, and a lot of these were happening when tribes were just now figuring out their treaties and their boundaries, and they very much helped with the settlement of the West, and encouraged homesteading and funded that, very much at the expense of the Indigenous peoples in the area, who were also very much being forced to take on this agrarian lifestyle as well. They were encouraged to be farmers, and a lot of times that didn't work in the areas they were located. It didn't work for homesteaders, and it certainly wasn't going to work for tribal members that were given allotments to be farmers and often funded these projects. So really looking at the legacies of land dispossession and also resource dispossession, and how these projects have lasting impacts on the regions, and how these projects, really solidified ongoing efforts that we see today for projects that are built in Indigenous communities at their expense, not for their benefit. So that continues with the legacies of pipelines, crossing water resources. Those aren't for the benefit of these Indigenous communities who often resist them, and that introduce more social ills, more inequity, that bring in oil companies and man camps to populations that are already very vulnerable. So I really want to make students think about not just the water resources, but what are the other impacts? What are the things that we're not thinking about in looking at these projects, and think about how we can be more mindful of development in the future. What does equitable development look like, and why these policies are so important. So that's from my teaching philosophy, and my research is similar in some ways. Still looking at the impacts of extraction on water quality, while trying to bring in these larger questions about inequity.
So I hear the importance of institutional structures and sort of the legacy impacts of those institutional structures, and in both how you frame your teaching and your research. And I really liked the question that you posed, is what does equitable development look like? I wonder, what are ways that we can expand as a hydrologic sciences community to address some of these issues that you bring up?
Yeah, so I find that when we talk about inequities and environmental justice, that they're often relegated to spaces, or just talk about marginalized people who often are associated with those inequities. Marginalized people and Indigenous people, they're often categorized in work that is considered, I often feel like my work is otherized, because I bring in this added layer of looking at the impacts on marginalized people while trying to do my work within hydrology, within environmental science, engineering, and I've always run into that. In graduate school, I had to find a professor, an advisor who was comfortable with my work in working with tribal communities, and really couldn't give me much guidance, of no fault of their own, but just really having to advocate for my work as fitting in an engineering, in a science field. And I would say that scholars that are in the same area feel the same way. So it's important to think about this broader definition of our work being inclusive of these types of questions. I have a lot of work that crosses over into policy, and you can't really talk about tribal waterways without discussing the policy, because it's a really important part of the question. And I don't know. I don't have a better the answer to that, but I think that that these forums and these fields could be more inclusive, and also uplift the work of the scholars that are doing this work, often mentoring other marginalized and Indigenous students, and encouraging them and letting them know that their interests are valued and that there's a space for them. And it's often, that work is often being done by these scholars in these spaces.
Yeah, thank you for all that you've brought voice to. Recognizing the challenge of even holding or sitting with inequity and making space for a conversation about that requires being present with a certain amount of discomfort. And so I'm happy in your journey that you found people that could be present enough, but it sounds like there's a long way we can go in a hydrologic sciences community to get more than enough, but to actually bring comfort and more dialogue around some of these complex issues. And I'm gonna frame a question again to sort of get us to think about like the future, the vision of if we were to expand the inclusivity into the hydrologic sciences, what would be the benefits for Indigenous communities and for the hydrologic sciences community alike? Or how would you see that unfolding? I know it's a big question.
Yeah, I think there could definitely be more opportunities for including the scholars, the students that did this work in making a targeted effort to include them in programming of professional societies. I'm on several kind of indigenous focused advocacy groups at professional societies like AGU, for example. I'm on the board of directors for the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. Can't really spread myself too thin, but always invited to be on several diversity organizations within these larger societies. So really making an inclusive effort and making space for these programs that bring us these scholars. So tribal colleges, there's so much great work being done there. I really try to make an effort to work with programs that are doing relevant work, but I know that's difficult because as a former tribal college faculty member myself, I was running the entire engineering program that we had, and don't have the capacity and the time to be running all these other research partnerships. But there luckily there was larger organization to do that with other tribal college faculty. So making that space, making that be a priority, including funding for the tribal colleges to be participants. I usually don't ask a tribal college to come on board with a project unless they're going to get the equal amount of funding that's available to us. And I don't see that in a lot of grants that I've applied to here. And it's like, well, why wouldn't they be included? And also to make it beneficial to them. And I would say that that's how you could bring in Indigenous scholars. If you're inviting them, are you thinking about how it's going to benefit them? Is it something that is going to advance their career? Or are you just asking of their time for, a one-off event that is I would say performative, just to show that there's diversity, because so many BIPOC Indigenous scholars are asked to do things, but it's really very taxing to do things that may not be beneficial in the long term. So that's something I encourage my students to do if they want to work with tribal communities. I say, if you're going to ask of their time, what's something that you could do? Can your project be beneficial to that community? Can your research contribute to this problem that you're trying to address? And I would say that's a start.
Yeah, and kind of following that, to bring that to our conversation here, are there ways, and I was going to ask this towards a little later on, but I'm going to move it up front given the conversation. Are there ways that the hydrologic sciences community listening to this seminar would be able to be supportive? Or are there events or anything coming up for you that would be supportive for you in your process of science at this time, or in your engagement in communities at this time?
So as I had mentioned, the professional societies, the groups that I'm working with, the AGU, for example, we have an ongoing Indigenous Action Committee that really a lot of the work that we do is for planning for the fall conference. And the efforts there are to make the meetings more accessible to Indigenous scholars, to highlight programming, which a lot of the scholars have done in organizing the programming anyway. And we're really thankful that that there have been those people to do that work on their own and get us to this point. So there are many opportunities to engage with those events, that programming at the fall conference. I know it's super busy, and I know so many of my colleagues, they run programs over the summer. They're organizing REU programs. I would say the geoscience Alliance and several other geoscience Indigenous collectives. There are several of them out there. I can't think of all their names, but they do regular programming and kind of self-organize and build community and really to support each other and to support the students that are coming through the programs and completing their graduate degrees. So there are definitely many opportunities to support the work that scholars are already doing and have organized for years in these spaces.
Thank you for sharing those. So I want to transition now to opening it up to questions from the attendees. So if you are having a question, you can press the Q&A and put your question in the Q&A. And to start, there's a question, one question that's in the chat that I'll start with. This person says, I'm working to learn more about the impacts of colonization and large water infrastructure. And do you have any recommendations for reading?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are several texts that I point to. One that I use in my own course is the Cadillac Desert, that talks about really any book that talks about the Bureau of Reclamation, the history of how that was founded, that talks about the policies. I mean, it's not necessarily framed in colonization, but you can make the connections there. I generally also assign readings about water rights. I think that's really important to think about and consider when thinking about these projects and how they've impacted tribes' abilities to control their resources. Really any type of water policy based textbook that provides that history. It depends on where you're looking. The water rights are different in each state. I think that there's a lot more current work on pipelines. So they often make that connection to colonization, to Indigenous sovereignty. I recently assigned a work by Tom Goldtooth of the Indigenous Environmental Network, and he talks about climate justice and really the legacy of pipelines. Winona LaDuke has several pieces about that as well. So I think you'd find that framing a lot more in discussion about pipelines.
Those are some great resources. Thank you. So we have another question. How best can Indigenous community knowledge be archived for academic hydrological purposes?
Indigenous community knowledge. This is an area that I'm not too familiar. I don't work in this area myself. But I would say that there are several resources on how to work with traditional knowledge, with Indigenous knowledge responsibly. Several of my colleagues work with data sovereignty, the how to do that respectfully. I know that the University of Arizona has a guideline on the care principles that kind of provide a framework for responsibly collecting data from tribal communities. Yeah, I would say that that in my own work, I have yet to really get into that area, because I mean, some of the things that I've said before, that we really have to justify our own work as being within the sciences, and then introducing culture, and anything that's not considered science is really difficult. And I think that so many scholars run into that, and as someone that's pre-tenure, trying to make the case for being in physical science, and always kind of being told that it's not completely science what you do. I mean, I couldn't imagine what my colleagues are going through that work more directly in these areas. So I would say that there's resources to address that question, but it really is up to the tribal communities on what they want to share. And that's, if they want to share it, how they want to share it. And I would say that you're probably not going to find a lot of databases on that, or come into the question of archiving that, because a lot of Indigenous peoples are very protective of their knowledge and how it's used, and they have every right to do so. That's along the lines of what I say in responsible relationships with our tribal communities, and building equity, and also having that respect for the communities, and what they want to share. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. I'm not necessarily the best person to speak on that.
Yeah, and there's another, it's not a question that came in, but I'm guessing that this person is suggesting a reference. So it looks like a book titled "In the Courts of the Conqueror: The 10 Worst Indian Law Cases Ever Decided." So I think that someone, I'll put this in the chat. That looks like a reference that someone is sharing. So another question that came in is, what are the hydrologic science data needed to address environmental injustice?
I'm guessing in tribal communities specifically.
Yeah, I would speak to that if that resonates.
Yeah, so I would say that there's a lot of data that's not available. There's a huge gap in data for tribal waterways. Having looked for these resources myself, I often find that tribal lands are excluded in any type of available database, and these are from federal agencies. So the USGS, FEMA does not have flood data on tribal lands, because they're they're just not covered there. Really any type of permit that you want to try to find, you have, there's usually not the best coverage in state databases. So you have that as well. The types of permits that I was looking for, they fall under the EPA because they have jurisdiction over tribal lands, whereas the state does not issue those. And those are also hard to find current information about that. And just water quality in general. I would say that the agencies probably try to rationalize that the tribes will be should or will be collecting this data themselves, and there's not much monitoring in terms of water quality, just really any type of water data that you want. And some tribes are more proactive than others. Some tribes have better capacity to take that data, and then making it publishable, putting it in a database is a whole different thing. The tribe may just have that to use internally. They may choose to put that online, like in an EPA database, or store it, or something. That I'm very familiar in trying to find available data. But usually there are huge data gaps. I would say that trying to find the right agencies to look for this information is kind of my first step. So for example, in my own research work, I was looking at water levels around coal seams in Montana and Wyoming, and I went to the Bureau of Mines and Geology that Montana has, and they had a whole data set that included tribal lands that I was able to use, and researchers that were familiar, mainly because there's a huge valuable coal seam there, and that's well tracked, the data on that. So yeah, it's really just trying to find the specific data, and it may be there by some agency that that has chosen to include tribal lands. So yeah, there's definitely a need for any type of hydrologic or water quality data in and around tribal lands.
So just to reflect back what I'm hearing, it sounds like, say a person went to work for a state or federal or county agency. One way that more inclusivity could be brought in is to have conversations with tribes to see if they want data taken, and if so, what type of data, and to start to engage in those places. Is that an active reflection of what you've said?
Yeah, well, I would say that the agencies are often limited on what their policy is in gathering data on tribal lands, but it's helpful to be aware of what happens to the same type of permits that would be issued on tribal lands. To recognize that there are often different requirements for state permits and permits that are issued by the EPA, although they're in the same waterway. It just so happens that they're issued on tribal lands. And I mean, I think that would be I think the person would have to have a reason to know about that. Specifically addressing tribal lands. I don't know if that would require a state mandate or training, but I haven't run into too many agency officials that are aware of the comparisons with their own state agency and looking at tribal lands. I mean, that would definitely be helpful.
So I have one last question here that's a multidimensional question before we wrap up. Could you talk a little more about how your interdisciplinary mindset informs your research? How does having an engineering education and experience inform your understanding of the more social or environmental justice aspects? And how does your understanding of social or environmental justice aspects inform ideas about the theory of engineering or development?
Yeah, I think that that it would have been really helpful for me to have more experience with just the terminology of environmental justice in my own education. And I think that would have really opened up the conversations around how to organize my own graduate program. I probably should have looked for more policy and that type of education, or looked for that methodology when I was organizing my own program. Yeah, it's been difficult, but I think that being in a department that allows me to address these issues is really helpful. I think that there are a few scholars in my own departments that kind of do similar work, but yeah, I don't know how, looking back, there's certainly some things that I would have changed, but I really encourage my own students I work with to, if they have interdisciplinary interests, to reach out to to other scholars, to other mentors, committee members that can be helpful to them, and would be supportive of their interdisciplinary work. And as as a mentor, if I have someone that wants to look at traditional knowledge, I very much support that. I don't discourage it. I just say, I'm not the best person to advise you on that. Definitely look for someone that that's their area of expertise, and I'll support your work and your projects. And I really wish that that was something that would have happened with me. So I think it just comes back to to really being inclusive of the ideas that the scholars that you mentor, and that I teach, really being encouraging of their interests, and yeah, and a lot of times that brings out some interesting collaborations with other scholars. My students always connect me to other projects that they're working on. So yeah, I would say that it's been beneficial, despite despite the struggles that I've encountered.
Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing all that you have shared today, giving really important perspective and an understanding for everyone listening. And I hope that this can help to encourage undergraduate and graduate students to open up these questions of inclusivity. So thank you so much, Dr. Grace Bulltail, for being here with us today. And thank you all the attendees for being here as well and for your great questions. And there are 2 more weeks and I look forward to seeing you next week for those of you attending. So thank you very much.